We're done. Well, good morning from Santiago de Chile. I'm Karen Poniachik, Director of Columbia University's Global Center here, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to another installment of our joint series with Universidad Diego Portales, UDP, on the future of journalists. We are delighted to have with us this morning Anya Schiffrin. She's director of the Technology, Media, and Communications Concentration at the School of International Public Affairs, SIPA, at Columbia, and author of several articles, research papers, and books, and editor of the forthcoming media chapter, How Money, Digital Platforms, and Government Control the News, which is probably out already. She'll tell us a little bit about that. And today she will be talking about social media, how social media is threatening democracy. I can't think of a more current topic for not only the US, but for all countries, including ours. Anya will speak for about 15-20 minutes, and then Paula Escobar. She will moderate a conversation with her. Paula is professor and researcher at Universidad Diego Portales. She's also head of the chair of the Women in Journal and Media series at Universidad Diego Portales. She's also an op-ed writer for La Tercera and participates in CNN Chile as a panelist in one of the most important talk shows, political talk shows here. So without further ado, Anya, I'll turn the screen over to you, and thanks for being this morning with us.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to work with the Columbia Global Centers. And of course, we've been collaborating for years with Diego Portales because our alum, Francisca Skolnick, is now there at the journalism program. So thanks also for Francisca for inviting me. It's really lovely of you all to come. And I know that I follow in some very serious footsteps because I understand that you've had other great speakers this fall, including Emily Bell, who I'm a real admirer of her work. The subject that I'll be talking about today is the universe of solutions for the problem of online mis and disinformation. I recently finished my dissertation for the University of Navarra. And what I did was I wrote about all the solutions and how they came about and whether they're working and what we can expect in the future. So I'll be talking about that today, and I won't show too many slides, but I will show a few because I think it may be helpful to sort of ground us a little bit in the subject before I proceed. So let me just share this slide here. I think that before we even begin talking about mis and disinformation, I just want to remind everybody that Claire Wardle from First Draft did a very good job of breaking down the 7 types of mis and disinformation. So one of the first things that happened after 2016 was scholars tried to understand what is mis and disinformation, because unless you understand what it is, you can't figure out ways to deal with it. So the first thing that happened was a lot of sort of definitions, and Tandock and Ling came up with another one. But you'll see that Claire Wardle makes the point that there are a lot of different things. There can be false context or manipulated content or fabricated or imposter, misleading, or satire. So it's not really, we don't really use the term fake news anymore. We more talk about mis and disinformation, and intent is part of that. So disinformation is often when people want to deceive. So what I've been really researching is the period after 2016. 2016 was a wake-up call. The election of Donald Trump in the United States, the support for Brexit, the election of these right-wing populist / demagogues in many parts of the world sort of woke people up to the idea that there was all of this mis and disinformation circulating online, and that we really needed to understand it and come up with some solutions. And part of what I argue in my dissertation is that a lot of the solutions people arrived at they arrived at before there was really a lot of academic research that was done. And so even though people weren't sure whether they would work the solutions, they felt like they had to do something. So they took action very quickly. And what I've tried to do is now step back a few years later to look at the different solutions and then really see, you know, did they work, didn't they work, what's the pros and cons? And what I've done is very different because I really oversimplify to make this easier for a lay audience instead of the sort of traditional communications theory about how information is produced and circulated, the idea of the two-step flow. I basically simplify and I refer to the solutions as either supply side or demand side. And I'll explain to you what I mean. But mostly demand side are the solution, or what I call the solutions that address audiences and audiences' consumption habits. And I call supply side the solutions that address the production and the dissemination of false information online. So that's kind of my overarching demand supply. It's simple, but it works. It helps people keep the ideas in their mind. So then my other point that I make is, why did so many thoughtful, educated people come up with really radically different solutions to the problem of online mis and disinformation? And I argue that basically there's three reasons for this. One is the financial interests involved. The second is the underlying beliefs of the groups proposing the solution. So for example, in the US, we tend to believe much more in sort of corporate self-regulation than government regulation. In Europe, obviously, there's much more trust for government and government regulation. And then finally, we have the exposure effect, which is people tend to believe that whatever they're doing is the right thing. It's a bit like escalating commitment. And so whatever they're doing, they want to do a little bit more of it, because I think if they keep doing the same thing, that will help them solve problems. So that's my sort of background explaining why we have all these different solutions. And then I'm going to give you an example of the solutions that I look at. So on the demand side, I'm just going to move this so I can see. I put things like media literacy training, for example, because one solution that was reached for after 2016 was the idea that if we can just educate people, they won't forward all this garbage. They won't believe all this garbage. And so it's really important to go into schools, talk to people, educate children, and help them become aware of, what is quality information, what is not quality information, how do journalists do their job, how can you tell if something looks suspicious. So media literacy training was a huge demand side solution that got a little bit more funding and a lot more attention after 2016. And I have a whole chapter on this, and I look all around the world at what kinds of training is being done. And I've just finished another chapter with Peter Cunliffe-Jones, who helped found Africa Check. And so he's done a whole look at media literacy. And I wrote the sections about around the world with lots of help from students. So anybody who's interested in this, I can give you a lot more information. And then another way of raising awareness is when journalists write about mis and disinformation, and they cover the tech companies and they cover all the, crazy, dangerous people online. So that's another point of demand side. You raise awareness, and then hopefully people's good sense will kick in. A second demand side intervention was the movement to build trust and engagement with local audiences. Now, this, of course, has happened many times in the past. For example, in the 1990s with the public or civic journalism movement. But the idea, journalists love this because the solution, as journalists always think, the solution for every problem is more good journalism. So after 2016, a lot of journalists, many parts of the world, said the problem was we haven't really gone out into the non-urban areas, and we need to go out and we need to talk to people, and we need to engage with our audiences, and we need to build their trust in media. And because in so many parts of the world, local news has really declined, the idea was that this would help address the news deserts. And the sort of fantasy was if we just rebuild local news, people will pay attention to local news and they will feel that their voices are heard. And they won't need to turn to sort of conspiracy theories and crazy stuff online. So that's a whole movement. There's lots of people at Columbia who are really involved with this movement, including Andrea Wenzel, Jacob Nelson at University of Arizona is another person. There are monthly phone calls about this. At Columbia with my students, we actually did a report called Bridging the Gap, which was about media trust, and interviewed groups all over the world. So there's a lot of information available on this sort of community participation, local engagement efforts. Internews is involved. I think Emily Bell made a point early on, which is that we definitely have a problem. There isn't enough local news, but this solution here may not address the larger problem of, what's happened to our democracy and our political polarization, but it's still a good thing to do. Then in the third category, which is sort of a demand side, sort of a supply side, is the whole movement to fact check and label suspicious content. I'm a big fan of NewsGuard, which is now something you can actually put onto your browser extension. They have basically looked at something like 6,500 news sites all around the world, and they give them a green or a red label. And then so as soon as you get onto one of these sites, you can very quickly see whether or not it's considered to be credible. And the Reporters Sans Frontières, they have a whole journalism trust project where outlets can sign on to be part of the trusted news providers, and then they have to agree to certain policies, like explaining how they do corrections, or where they get their funding, or how they do the processes by which they gather news. So the idea is, again, if you can make it more transparent, then audiences will know what to trust. So I think all of these ideas are really important. And it's very important also to show that, we're not giving up on truth and on accuracy, and that these things matter, and to build really a culture of truth. So the first part of my dissertation is really about these solutions. And I think they're all really important. I think they're all underfunded, need far more funding, and find ways to make it scalable. Because what we're seeing in a lot of places is that these are small scale. So you have some media literacy in some schools, but not in others, not really a clear definition of what is media literacy. Same with local news reporting. It's very micro. And Claire and others are working on how to make these models more scalable. And there's a whole lot of other things I talk about. Same, fact checking as well, I think is really important. But what's different about today's, the first generation of contemporary fact checking was that they would debunk something after it had appeared. Whereas previously, fact checking at the New Yorker, the Vanity Fair, the famous fact checking places, the Nation, they would check it before it appeared. So I'm very interested in what's called second generation fact checking, which you can Google and learn about, where people like Laura Zomer from Chequeado and Peter Cunliffe-Jones are now trying to be more proactive, in fact. So those are my supply side solutions, and I'll just run through, those are demand side. I'll run through supply side, and then I'll stop showing slides so that we can just have a discussion. So then I look at the supply side of the mis and disinformation, and there are a whole lot of things on that side that are being done. So one is the idea, which was the classic American idea, which is we have a First Amendment, we don't want to regulate. So really, let's just treat ideas like a marketplace of ideas. And let's just provide more quality speech. So if we support quality news, local news, media pluralism, then we're going to have enough to outweigh the bad stuff. Now, my husband and I have written a little bit about why the marketplace of ideas doesn't actually really function online anymore for a whole lot of reasons. Zuckerberg keeps talking about it, but it's not a market that's open. There isn't equal access. We don't know who's receiving what messages. So I wouldn't call Facebook actually an open marketplace of ideas. A second set of fixes for online mis and disinformation is the idea that if we had more transparency and more disclosure from the tech companies, then we would be able to solve the problem. So for example, more truth in advertising. We've just come through an election in which there was a lot of mis and disinformation online. And one of the goals has been in the US is to pass the Honest Ads Act, which would at least require people that advertise online to declare themselves. And Facebook and Twitter and well, Twitter's no longer taking political ads, but Facebook, Google, they started the ad libraries, but those have really been insufficient. And we can certainly talk more about that, or I can refer you. Maybe somebody could put in the chat. I just wrote a paper for the Roosevelt Institute about election advertising. So maybe someone could put a link to that in the chat. Then a three more. Another point is algorithms. So there's a whole lot of sort of use of AI and NLP to control, take down, downrank, not recommend mis and disinformation. And this has been sort of the preferred method of the tech companies, plus hiring some content moderators. And I think at the beginning, I think maybe 3-4 years ago, everybody had this sort of fantasy like, wow, if the tech companies could just take this stuff down, then the rest of us wouldn't really have to deal with it. And that would be wonderful. We wouldn't have to have any icky laws. We wouldn't have to worry about the First Amendment. They could just take the stuff down, right? Or hide it or slow it down. And they're certainly doing that. And they certainly have been doing more of that ahead of the elections and with COVID, which we can also talk about. Now then, there came this view that, okay, we tried self-regulation. The EU, that was the first thing they tried with the tech companies, and it didn't really work. So now we have to change the incentives so that the tech companies will actually take action. They'll do something. So one attempt to force them to take action has been the advertising boycott movement. This has been around for a while. I never thought it would take off, but last summer it got the Stop Hate campaign, especially in the lives of in view of Black Lives Matters, really took off and got a lot of attention and got a lot of companies to sign on and just say, we don't want our ads near all this hate speech, and we don't want to be near all this mis and disinformation, and we're not going to advertise on your platforms until you can guarantee where our ads will appear. And this is part of the brand safety movement. I have a wonderful alum who's working for a place called Moat in London. His name is Jay Pino. They've done some excellent reports. So again, lots of information I can share on the brand safety and advertising movement. And then finally, we come to regulations. And as I was writing my dissertation, I started like a normal American, former journalist, very pro First Amendment. And I surprised myself because after doing the research for 3 years, I really started to feel that regulations are going to be a really important part of this. And what's happened in Europe, really in Germany, is they have removed the protections that the tech companies have from from liability for third-party user-generated content. And in Germany now, they have a law called the NetzDG. And if the platforms have a persistent habit of allowing illegal speech to appear on the platforms, they have to take it down within 24 hours, I think it is. And if they don't, they can be fined. Now, unfortunately, these are very big, rich companies. So fines don't do a lot. But before NetzDG was passed, there was a big fear that it would lead to over censorship, over blocking, that Facebook would just take everything down because they'd be afraid of breaking the law. But this has not actually happened. So Germany is now looking at revising their law on intermediary liability. Biden, an interesting group of people in the US, Biden, George Soros have said they think that law needs to be repealed or changed. And there's been a sort of big debate about that. The US the House, I think it was, recently issued a big report that they had done. Unfortunately, it was hard. It was a bipartisan effort. And I think once the report came out, the Republicans had very different ideas about how to regulate than the Democrats did. But certainly, this is bubbling up in the air. And I think the challenge is, the EU has said they're going to be revising some of their laws on mis and disinformation. Canada right now is looking at modernizing their hate speech laws. So I think that there's a ton of good laws that can be done. And the problem, of course, is that later on, countries which control the internet and control media come along and say, well, Germany's doing it, so why are you getting mad at us? So I think I think for a long time, this has been sort of an excuse, a reason that people don't support regulation. They say, well, if it's fine for Germany, it's fine for Sweden, but then Singapore's going to copy it, Vietnam's going to copy it, all the dictators are going to copy it, Turkey's going to copy it. And I think, I've thought about that a lot. And obviously I worked for a couple of years as a journalist in Vietnam. So I'm pretty familiar with state control of media and information and what happens. And, I've come to the conclusion that countries like Vietnam, countries like China, countries like Hungary, they don't really need our help. They know how to censor the internet. And I think that if you have sort of well-run democracies, if the Germanys and the Swedens and the Canadas of this world or Australia want to regulate, then I think they're going to have to go ahead and do it for themselves and for their own people and not spend too much time, not stop because it may get misused by somebody else. Those people, we know who they are. They've been, censoring the media for decades, and they're going to keep doing it, whether or not Germany passes a law. So I don't think we can be too intimidated. And, again, I won't go on too long, but I'm very interested in laws that might make sense. And again, I can put in the chat. I wrote a piece. Finland and France have anti-cyber harassment laws, which are, terrific laws, and they protect journalists and they protect people and they make it easier to go after harassers. So I think in closing, I'll just comment that COVID-19, I'm sure Emily Bell talked to you about this, she's so interesting on the subject, has been fascinating because during the pandemic, it turned out that, YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, everybody could do a lot to try to stem the disinformation, the misinformation online, right? And now, of course, what's happened, everyone said, well, if you do know how to do it, then why aren't you doing it for everything else? Why aren't you doing it for violent speech or lies about Hillary Clinton or racist speech that attacks, the Black community? Like, actually, you know how to do this, so why aren't you doing it? And since I finished my dissertation, just in the last, really since the summer, there's been a whole lot of really interesting reports on how we should be regulating, including the Transatlantic Working Group. Reporters Without Borders put out a report last week that I helped work on. So I think now we're at a place, I think in 2016, everyone said, oh my God, this is terrible. What is it? What are we going to do about it? I think now we actually have a ton of great ideas and research, and it's really more about the political will to do something. So I think we have a lot of solutions now, and it's been really great for the last 3 years to study them. So I'm happy to talk to our moderator, Paula, or to take questions or anything else. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anya. Wonderful conference about, of course, a very, very important issue these days everywhere. So I would like to begin to ask you about regulation. As you said, now there feels like there is momentum, especially in Europe. This is the strategy that is advancing now. And in today's newspaper, especially the problem in Spain with the government trying to pass a law against this disinformation, and the main point is said by the people that are opposing Pedro Sanchez's law is that it affects free speech, and which is also the same problem that is addressed every time there's a regulation based on a law. So what do you think about that? Do you think it's really incompatible to have free speech and also this kind of regulations?
Yeah, could you tell me, I'd love to know a little more about the law. I don't actually know about it.
You know, the law by the government of Pedro Sanchez is against disinformation, and it wants to recognize, identify, evaluate, and to explain threats through social media, and it's related to fake news, all those kinds of things. They suffered that in the last election, so they want to have a weapon to fight against that, and the law is called a procedure to act on disinformation. So there's a lot of, of critics and opposition, because, how the government is going to have the power to decide what is fake news. And of course, it opens, especially in non-democratic governments, or in governments that are, shifting towards authoritarian regimes, giving them the power to decide what is fake. And sometimes, of course, it's not fake, it's opposition points of view to them.
Right. So I think, one big problem is that all these people that are putting out disinformation are hiding behind the First Amendment and freedom of speech. And it's a very disingenuous, they don't actually care that much about freedom of speech, right? They just want the right to lie, and they're using that. So, I haven't seen this particular law, but I think that there are probably millions of things. I mean, let's remember what's happened to Sanchez, right? Which is the constant drumbeat of lies by the conservatives in Spain, who are constantly comparing him to, Maduro, Chavez, which is, by the way, why the Democrats lost Florida, right? Because there was this constant barrage of disinformation that was targeted at particular voting groups. So, again, not having seen the Spanish law, I would have thought that there would be loads and loads of things you could do. So just, again, labeling who you are. If you're saying that Sanchez is a Chavista or supports Maduro, that's a piece of political messaging. Does it say where it came from? Do we know who put that out there? Like, that's a totally reasonable. And, in the US, there have been some court cases that forced disclosure also violates the First Amendment. But, perhaps in Spain or in Europe, that's a sort of a basic, who are you? Who's getting this message? How much did you pay? Did you pay for it? That to me seems totally reasonable. I think in Germany, false facts are not actually protected speech. Opinion is protected, but not false facts. I have no idea. I doubt Spain has a law like that, but I don't actually know. So I think there's all kinds of labeling that can be done as well. So disclosure, labeling, without having seen the law, I don't know enough about the threats to free speech, but I certainly don't think that it's, a God-given right to tell a lie about somebody. And as Jack Dorsey of Twitter said, you have a right to expression, but you don't actually have a right to virality. So again, I'll have to take a look at the Spanish law and learn about it. I'm guessing maybe it has some elements in common with the Avia bill from France, which was passed, but certain parts of it were struck down. And I can also say in general, what a lot of people have been calling for in Europe is particular courts to make decisions on what needs to be taken down. Because, this has to be done very, very quickly, right? Otherwise, once it's viral, it's kind of too late. So I'd be interested to see whether the Spanish law has set up, an agency or a bureaucracy to handle those kinds of requests very quickly. But, this whole argument, one of the things that the tech people keep saying in the US is, oh, it's so complicated. It's just too complicated. We can't regulate. And every time Zuckerberg, goes to speak to Congress later, they all say, oh, Congress are a bunch of old guys. They don't understand anything. They're not able to regulate. Look at the UK Parliament. And I have two responses to that. First of all, if the tech companies think that the regulators don't understand, well, then the tech companies should have to help them, obviously. And second of all, we don't say, well, gee, pharmaceuticals are so complicated, we better not regulate them. Banking is so complicated, we better not regulate it. Like, that's ridiculous. If something is really complicated, then it definitely needs to be regulated. And we're going to need to create a bureaucracy and a civil service and a court system that can regulate, because this is not going away. And what's annoying is that normal people and governments have to spend all their money and time on this problem that actually Facebook basically, and YouTube basically created and Google created. So, as Andy Guest from Princeton says, the opportunity costs are incredible. But so I would assume the Sanchez law is going to also include a sort of infrastructure for enforcement. Great. Thank you.
That's really important, Anya, because as you said, the problem of how to give, not only to affect free speech is one of the main focus of the people that oppose regulations, but also that who is going to have the power to take some information down, even if it's fake. So that's the main point, right? Should we give the government, that enormous power to say, okay, this is not going to be part of the public debate? So do you think, as you were saying, like a new infrastructure might be the one dealing with this?
So, Paula, it's a really good point that you're making. And I feel like that's what everybody was saying around 2016, 2017, like, oh God, we don't want the government to be in charge. And I remember one time I had a really great panel that I organized at Columbia. My husband came and he said after, people from Facebook, community check journalists, and he said afterwards, well, what do people want, right? Access, they don't want any government censorship and they don't want corporate censorship. Well, it's got to be one or the other, right? And the other thing I always have to remind people, because I get this a lot, like, oh, are you supporting government censorship, is we already have corporate censorship. It's not like nothing's happening right now. What is happening right now is that, Facebook and Google and YouTube, they're making decisions all the time, right? They're making decisions and their algorithms are making decisions about what to show you, what to recommend, what to take down. So it's not like we're in this pure free market world and the government's going to come and ruin it. Basically, we're in like a disastrous world where we had all of this self-regulation. And as a result, we've had people dying all over the world and all this hate speech and incitement and violence. So, in that situation, frankly, I would rather a democratically elected government step in than let these enormous companies that, by the way, don't even pay taxes, make decisions for the rest of us. So, I wish it would be great if it were perfect. It's not perfect. And so this is I feel like with the whole misinformation, it's a bit like COVID. You're always looking at least bad options.
Yeah.
Whole story of 2020. Nothing's good. Nothing's what I want. What is the least dangerous? And that's very similar to what we're dealing with here in the mis and disinformation.
Yeah. What's your opinion, Anya, about the performance of these big media companies in the U.S. election this year? Because they promised, most of them, to do, to take a lot of measures, to do a lot of plans to stop fake news, disinformation. So what's your evaluation so far?
Yeah, well, I think, it's still sort of coming in, and there's been some really interesting articles and panel discussions I can recommend. I think that Facebook, well, Twitter, of course, decided they wouldn't take any political advertising. And, all of the tech companies, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, I think Google, have been trying to do, I think, a couple of things, right? So one thing is they've been trying to put quality information higher up. So if you go on Facebook and you're in the US, they tell you where you can vote, for example. Or they will give you, Google has those cards that give you information about the sort of, the original website or the trusted source. So I think they've all been trying to put, remember we talked about supply side, demand side, right? So they're trying to increase the supply of quality information. And as we know, in this world where there's so much information, increasing the supply of quality information doesn't necessarily help that much, right? Zeynep Tufekci has talked about the drowning out. So has Tim Wu. What you have to do is increase the supply of salient quality information. And so to some extent, that's what they've tried to do. They've tried to make it conspicuous where you see it, direct you straight away, to the WHO website instead of COVID. So on one hand, they've been trying to boost the supply of quality, salient information. And on the other hand, they've also tried to fact check, label, tweak the algorithms, moderate more. They always, whenever Facebook catches a bunch of Russian trolls or whatever, they always make a big deal about it and publicize it. So they've definitely done more. They have not done enough. And then I think you were also asking just about the regular media. And that's, of course, you know, a huge polemic. And, Yochai Benkler and Hal Roberts and Robert Farris all wrote this fantastic book that came out a couple years ago called Network Propaganda, where they really mapped, a lot of people have done this, so has Alejandro Romero from Alto in Madrid. They've mapped how the disinformation starts in the extreme websites and then travels to the mainstream legacy media and gets picked up and amplified. So, WikiLeaks and all these rumors about Hillary Clinton were a good example. So, I think we've got a problem. I think that Trump has been obviously excessively amplified. He came to power, but he helped all the TV stations, get better ratings, and they amplified him too much. And I think when he became president, they were journalists were really stuck because it's the president, so you have to cover him. But as we saw, he's the disinformation spreader in chief, and it has had disastrous effects on this country. I think also what's fascinating is now that he's lost the election, he's already getting less attention, right? So Fox is less supportive, and ditto Twitter's labeling more, and so I look forward to the day that he's deplatformed. And so what you've seen now is that the conservatives base are actually moving over to smaller websites and smaller sites like Parler or other news sites, because they want to get away from what they're calling, the liberal bias of Facebook. I'm just going to drink a little water here while you ask me the next.
Yeah, please go ahead. And we invite all of you, if you want to send questions to Anya, please, in the Q&A section of this webinar, you can put them. Okay, so I can't not ask you about this, but this unprecedented election in the U.S. when the President Trump still not recognizing that Joe Biden won. So what's the relationship with that social media and traditional media? And but looks like no one cares so much that he's not conceding the victory to Joe Biden, is it?
So, it's interesting because it's really a sign again of how polarized our country has become, because I think you've seen that most of the Republican voters don't believe that the election was stolen. So I think what we've learned, we didn't need to learn it. We already knew it. But what we've learned these last 4 years is that, if the president lies and lies and lies repeatedly, he will eventually persuade a certain number of people. And that's what we've seen with this election. I think the rest of us know it's a lie and really aren't that bothered by it. But it's certainly very corrosive, and it's hindering the transition as well, because Biden's team needs funding so they can start moving. And, Trump, as we were talking about earlier, Trump promised a vaccine. So now the vaccine is almost here for COVID. And where's the plan for distribution? So if you believe in a vaccine, you should have made a plan. They didn't make a plan. And so that's something Biden's going to have to deal with. And that's going to have to be done very, very quickly. So he's got to do. And the lying has real world consequences, as we were afraid of. I saw somebody was asking about fact checking.
Yeah.
Which
Please
is,
go ahead.
Yeah, always a great question. And what I wanted to say was that Facebook has actually been funding a huge amount of fact checking over the last few years. And again, I'm more than happy. I've written a little bit about this. Other people have written about it. And so fact checking does go on. And I think you asked, when it's not questioned by journalism. Yeah, so it doesn't have to be questioned by journalism. It can be, what Facebook is doing is paying for fact checks after stuff has appeared. And I think if you're interested in how well this has worked, there's a fact checking organization in England. I think it's called qualitative fact or full fact. I can't remember which. Maybe someone could look and put it in the chat. And they did a really good report last year on how his fact checking worked. And there's been some stuff written, also published, I think, by the Tao Center about the relationship of Facebook to fact check. There's been some criticisms of it, but the answer is, yeah, you can absolutely do fact checking, or it's called, debunking.
Yeah.
Really afterwards. Go ahead.
And there's another question by Veronica Guzman. She says, what is the most advanced country in legislation regulation about this topic in the world?
So, I mean, it depends like what kind of legislation you like. But I would say as always, Europe is the place to look at. So I would say, yeah, it really depends. So intermediary liability, Germany moved on that. Election advertising, obviously France has done a very good job. The EU in general has a lot of restrictions. If you're looking at media literacy, Canada is a place that people often point to. If you're looking at provision of information and support for quality journalism, then certainly Northern Europe, Norway has fantastic rules on this. Sweden has very high levels of trust in their public broadcaster. The radio especially has very high levels of trust. And the thing I'm really excited about right now and looking at very closely is Australia is trying to get Google and Facebook to pay for the news that they use. Yeah, you know all about that. And they're going to be voting on this in the next few weeks. And what's so interesting about that is in Europe, when they tried to do this, they used copyright law and it didn't work. So what they're trying to do in Australia is use competition law, because they're saying that there's a power imbalance between the publishers and the tech companies. And the publishers should be able to negotiate with the tech companies to get payments for the news that's being disseminated. And if they can't agree on a price, then they go into arbitration. So I think that's really exciting, and I'm obviously hoping that that will get passed. And Google and Facebook have been playing really nasty. Google's been putting out these alerts saying we're not going to cover, local news anymore. And the big worry, of course, is that this will really help Rupert Murdoch because he has such a large market share in Australia. But I still think it's an important law. Paula, are people looking at this in Chile? Might Chile pass something similar?
I don't know, because every time there's a debate about this comes the argument about free speech. So, I'm not sure. I think but of course there's the concern about how democracy is being weakened by social media. And I wanted to ask you something else that is happening now in Chile, Anya, that is related to political threats through social media made by anonymous people, mostly to political leaders. This week, for example, was about a law that is being debated in the parliament this week about being able to again retire 10% of the pension funds because of COVID emergency. So some members of parliament has been harassed through social media and exposed their personal information and all that. So what can be done? Because that's another way of threatening democracy, through social media.
Totally. What did you say they want to do about the pensions? Do they want to reduce the pension?
No. There's a second law being debated in Chile to allow people to take some parts of their pension funds, for the second time, this time 10% at tops, to help people, go through this emergency, the financial emergency of COVID. So, it's a very, very popular measure, and I think it has 90% of approval in people, but some politicians and some people have concerns about what's going to happen in the future of these pensions, because of course they're going to be reduced. So then during this debate, there's been threats, and it's happening, every time. It's more common to have that kind of threats through social media, exposing private information and things like that.
Yeah, so obviously strong cyber harassment laws should be implemented immediately in Chile. I do think, one of the things I really tried to focus on my dissertation is like low-hanging fruit. and things that everybody should be able to agree on. And if you can't agree that, violent threats on social media should be illegal, then I really don't know what you can agree on. And I mentioned earlier about France and Finland having very good anti-cyber harassment laws. And I wrote a column for Project Syndicate about the French law. So I would have thought that would be the kind of thing that Chile should absolutely implement. And also, now that it's politicians that are getting threatened, they may be more sympathetic to passing a law. To believe, a lot of, I think, the early internet regulation is that we have all these laws that apply to life offline, and nobody got around to putting them online. I mean, offline, you probably wouldn't be able to threaten a politician. So why on earth should you be able to do it online? I mean, that really makes no sense. Somebody was asking in the chat about whether I've given up on the internet as a way of helping democracy. And you're right that in 2011, right, with the uprisings all over the world, and everybody thought this is fantastic, and there's all these new digital affordances, and it's going to be able to help protesters, and it's going to be able to help, small upstart political campaigns. And we have this debate in the US about micro-targeting, for example, where one idea for regulation is if you don't want to touch speech because you're worried about freedom of expression, then at least you can limit micro-targeting, right? Because part of what makes these messages so effective is that they are targeted at particular people. So in the US, there's kind of a debate about how to limit or whether to ban micro-targeting. And people point out that if you're a new politician without a lot of experience, somebody like, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, you need to be able to micro-target to reach your audiences. So I think privacy regulation will be important. But yeah, I think we're all really disillusioned about what has happened to democracies around the world because of social media. And I think, right, this fantasy that these guys in Silicon Valley all had, that just building community and getting people together. I don't think any of us thought, oh God, when people get together, the first thing they're going to do is start, insulting minorities and women and making threats. I don't think any of us expected that. And it's good that we didn't expect that because we're obviously nice people, but now we've seen what's going on. Yeah, it's totally a threat to democracy. Absolutely.
Yeah. And Anya, what do you think about the relationship between social media and traditional media, and the influence that social media has had so far in traditional media, in the sense that sometimes it's being taken away to that kind of, to compete with that, and in that competition, losing standards that at the same time create less trust in traditional media. What are your thoughts about that?
Sure, absolutely. Sorry, I was just answering a question in the chat about banning targeted advertising. I feel like I sort of addressed that, which is there's a consensus that it should be limited, if not banned altogether. Yeah, I think, when you look at the sort of studies of media trust, it's pretty clear that the internet really confused everybody. Up until then, and this, this sort of has to do with news literacy, that before the internet, it was kind of clear credibility was easier to ascertain, right? So was it in the New York Times, or was it in a left-wing magazine? Was it, the article big? Was it on top of the fold? So there were all these, heuristics that provided all these unspoken signals. And when the internet came along, it muddled people up, because all of a sudden you can't tell what's true and what's not true. You don't know where it came from. You don't know who's seeing it. You don't know, why it was put up there. So I think that the decline in trust in media is partly attributable to the confusion that reigns online. And I think that there's no question that the financial problems hitting the media contributed to this quest for clicks and engagement, and that lowered the quality. So I think it's been, a real vicious cycle. Personally, I agree with Julia Angwin and Tim Carr and Free Press and many others who think that we actually need to get the tech companies to pay billions of dollars to help support quality journalism. You know, I think it's very nice that Google's giving $5,000 or $15,000 grants to startups around the world, maybe even 50,000, but that's not going to solve the problem whatsoever. And I also question, I don't think the solution is starting like a whole bunch more startups, because they go on and it's hard for them to survive. Like, actually what we need are large quality institutions. And, you know, I think the tech companies should pay for it, frankly. What Free Press is proposing is actually a tax on targeted advertising to pay for it. You know, there's a lot of different ideas. There's a bunch of bills in Congress right now. By the way, I would love to come back next year, because I've just finished a report on solutions for how to help journalism financially, and the solutions that have emerged since the COVID pandemic. So I'm looking at that right now. But yeah, I think there's been a lot of good stuff, and there's been a lot of destruction as well.
Yeah.
Find it striking. You know, when I first started lecturing about mis and disinformation in my class, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, my students thought I was crazy. And they were kind of like, it's only my grandparents that believe that garbage. You know, nobody else. We understand the internet. We're young. We get it. And now, of course, my students are coming to class and saying, I don't know what to look at. I don't know what to trust. I don't know what to read. And often, so I'm having to do like kind of basic media literacy in the first weeks. Like, this is, you know, journalists don't take money, for example. They're not supposed to take money, or, you know, they're supposed to report both sides, and just kind of explaining that. And it's been fascinating, because I've spent so much of my life around journalists that it's been really interesting to learn that if you're not a journalist, there's all this stuff you just don't know. So you don't actually know the difference between some random tweet and, you know, what you're seeing in a quality outlet. So that's been quite fascinating.
Anya, do you think that we journalists should have a code, or some kind of code to use social media, or it should be open to anyone to do? I mean, some media companies have decided to limit the scope of the social media expression of the journalists, and some people oppose that idea because it's against their own freedom and to create their own brand in one way. So do you think, as social media expression is such a threat to democracy, should we have in common some kind of ethic code or something like that?
You know, I think it would be difficult. That's a really interesting question. I think it might be difficult to get people all over the world to sign up for a code. But as you said, a lot of outlets do have rules about that. And I do think that's important, because I do think that if we're trying to, assert the honesty, the integrity, the credibility of journalists, then tweeting all kinds of weird things at, just because you've had too much coffee or you're offended, 8 a.m., I think that is counterproductive. Yeah, it's amazing to me, the stuff that people put on Twitter, frankly. But I know lots of people, believe in it and love doing it. But yeah, I would have thought it wouldn't be the best way to promote credibility necessarily.
Yeah. Related to the coverage of the US election, there was something that got a lot of attention here. That was when I think it were 2 or 3 TV chains in the US cut off President Trump when he began to say, fake things. So do you think that's something that must be done? Are you okay with that? Do you think it has to be a new standard? Like if you see a politician or a leader saying something that is false, to cut him down?
Yeah, and it's so interesting when these questions come up, everybody focuses on the journalist. Like, did the journalist do that? And is it ethical of the journalist? Well, what about the politician, right? I think it's so sad that journalists have had to become the enforcers for truth in our societies, and then get blamed for it all the time. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's a responsibility not to amplify lies, disinformation. And I also think that it's really important. I think one of the successes of the fact-checking movement has been in some countries, not everywhere, but in some countries, if you report that a government official is telling an untruth, in some places they will be embarrassed and they will stop doing it. right? And there's a little bit of research on this. So somebody like Bolsonaro, somebody like Trump, they don't care. They're shameless, right? They're totally sin vergüenza. But when people are capable of being shamed, then hopefully this cutting them off will remind them that they shouldn't be lying. And yeah, I definitely think journalists have a responsibility not to amplify as much as possible. The other thing that we've seen is not just cutting off, but breaking in with fact checking, like the 60 Minutes interview. And that was, I thought, really interesting and really useful. And, journalists have a much harder job now. I mean, it used to be you could go into the White House and just report what the president was saying. And now when you go in, you have to know so much so that you can report that he's lying or not report the lies. So the demands on journalists as professionals have been much higher in these last 3 years, for sure.
Yeah, and sometimes you can't just fact check simultaneously. I mean, it's you need some time to do that accurately. So, and what else can be done not to amplify these voices that are talking like Donald Trump? Because the rise of populism and populist discourse is a global threat. So besides not amplifying fake news or fake information, what else can be done to diminish the impact of these populist voices or these people talking things that are not really true?
Yeah, so, well, a few things. I mean, one is I agree with Michael Schudson, which is, the basic problems that we have in our societies right now, they weren't caused by social media and they weren't caused by journalism, right? We have polarization for a whole lot of reasons, including economic inequality, and lack of education. So poor old journalists are once again coming in to try to fix a problem that they actually didn't create. So I think we need to be clear about that, right? With all the coverage in the world and all the not amplifying isn't solving the root of the problem. In terms of the platforms, I always say it's like WhatsApp in India or something is like the match to the brittle house, right? So the house was brittle and the social media platforms struck a match. So I think underlying are obviously economic and solutions and political solutions. But I do think that there's sort of people at the margin and seeing these right-wing demagogues lying and inciting hatred sort of spurs them on and makes them feel that it's acceptable. So I have to believe that when people like Trump, exit the stage, it's going to allow some of those people in the middle to become a little less, riled up and a bit more reasonable. I'll give you an example. Half the country in the US, right, has said they don't want to take a COVID vaccine. And this is down, I think it was 54% a few weeks ago. The numbers of people who won't take it are falling. But I really think that, if Biden goes up on TV and gets the vaccine, it's going to help. It just is. And so I don't think all our problems are going to go away, but I think even just a little bit of a change of, what's acceptable and returning a little more to normalcy, I think that may help somewhat.
Thank you so much. I think we have 1 more minute if you want to answer one of the questions in the chat room.
Okay, let me take a look. I'll be happy to. Thanks everybody for coming, by the way.
Yeah.
What to do when
we can do that. This Kristen thought, what to do when the executive branch government itself creates networks and digital control in parallel with the state, intercepting people's private communications. Very typical in this time of COVID-19.
I'm not quite sure. Yeah, I don't quite sure know what that means exactly, what you're referring to exactly. But yeah, sure, the government is going to intercept and look at. So I don't quite understand that, but I will say that in general, I think that for COVID, one thing that's been really important has been promoting communications from reliable sources like the WHO or this, the CDC. And we've just been looking in one of my classes at Columbia, my capstone, at communications of COVID around the world. And it's been really interesting how many countries have actually done a great job. You know, Vietnam, Taiwan, there's lots of places that were able to counter disinformation. New Zealand, very, very quickly, especially small countries as well. So that report will be out fairly soon if anybody wants to read it. But, you know, there's lots of good examples. And I think that's the main thing I try to keep in mind is, you know, as I teach my class at Columbia or speak on panels, there's so many things that we can do to fix these problems. And it's really just about, you know, getting organized and political will and fighting big financial interests, because obviously Facebook and Google are very happy with the way things are now. They're making a lot of money off it. So it's going to take some laws, some regulation to really get this under control, I think.
Yeah, well, we're on time. Thank you so much, Anya, for this wonderful conference and talk about one of the main issues of our time.
It's really a pleasure, and I hope that in 2021 we'll all be vaccinated. I can come in person. That would be great.
We can have you here, you know. Hopefully we will all be vaccinated next year, so we can have you here. And thank you all for being here today with us. Thank you, Universidad de Portales and Columbia Global Centers, and see you in our next activities.